Hello, everyone, and un gusto estar acá for those who are Spanish speakers, if there's any in the room. I'm certainly grateful to have the opportunity to share this experience we had with Emilie, which was quite serendipitous, I think. I am originally from Argentina. My name is Hernán Dario Jourdan. I go as Nanshuba. And I think I want to say that it has been quite a journey to get to the US. And I have been living in Providence, Rhode Island for the last 10 years. Now I'm in Argentina, actually, but that's where I have my practice. And yeah, I think that as someone who has been in different spaces and shared different cultures, one thing that's really present in my work is this cross interdisciplinary approach, both across disciplines in the arts. I'm coming from the theater and the filmmaking world to offer performances, live events, but also I've been working a lot with scientists recently to inform the work, the research that I have been doing, which is also what drove me to Swell House eventually. And I think the last thing I'll say as far as introductions is that as someone from South America, my lived experiences of colonization might be slightly different to those who have been living in the US. And that comes also with inhabiting different identities, such as in the US, I might be perceived as someone, a person of color, and in Argentina, my identity shifts. So that is also part, I think, of the practice that ends up being part of my practice and the hybrid nature of the work that I do. So I think those things are important to share when going into the work that I'll be sharing. Yeah, do you want to say anything about yourself, Emilie?
Yeah, sure. Thank you. I'm Emilie Houssart. I live in the Hudson Valley in Poughkeepsie, New York. I'm an artist and curator. I currently am the artistic director of a local nonprofit community art center, and I'm an adjunct professor at SUNY New Paltz in the art department. My heritage is Dutch, and I grew up in the UK and have a Huguenot surname. So it was kind of a loaded position to show up in this area of the United States and find all the change that has happened here over the last few centuries because of settlers from my own background. Super interesting position to find myself in as an artist and as a person. And so really all my work is coming from that perspective. You know, I almost think of myself as a super colonizer in this area, which I think is just like a very interesting opportunity to have some quite difficult conversations. And as an artist, I'm always looking for ways to make those really digestible and accessible. And so I use absurdist humor a lot in my work. Also coming from a theater background, hugely influenced by theater of the absurd playwrights. And I'm currently making living installations that are designed to fail, and examining food systems in particular in the US, which is a very complex issue because it's connected to affordability of food. It's connected to the amount of people who need to be fed. It's connected to very toxic uses of land and soil fertility issues, which are, you know, finite fertility of the ground, pollinator extinctions. It's a huge complex issue, and it usually comes with a rather heavy moral weight to it. So I feel like being able to make those things tangible and absurd, and creating strange monuments that shift forms themselves, gives me an opportunity to think about the aesthetics of success and failure in this culture, and how that's shifted because of colonization, and how we can maybe restore rights to relationships that people ought to have and have been stripped of by a colonizer culture, from things like, you know, the microbes that live underfoot and the microbes that occupy and colonize and sorry, that's not quite the right word. We are a whole community in our bodies, as we all know in this symposium. You know, we are not separate beings. So this idea of having an isolated identity is not only a cause of great destruction and inequality, but also is a huge mental health issue for many people. So on many, many levels, I think it's something that needs to be urgently addressed. And I also think that that psychological element is really crucial to changing behaviors, which will lead to a much more healthy way of life for planetary future. That was quite long-winded. And then I also run something called the Dirt Project, which is a kind of series of very playful experiential workshops for all ages, specifically to try and restore those relationships, particularly with soil, but also talking about internal microbe communities and, you know, using simple facts like you have more microorganisms in your body than you have human cells. So the idea of having a separate identity is really absurd. It's very joyful, I think, to sort of let go of that idea. So it's rather toxic. So that's kind of going on the side too.
Amazing. Yeah.
Hernán,
So
would you? Oh, sorry, go on.
yeah, so interesting how this idea that we're all interconnected, right, is present in your work through the soil sculptures you do, and also how we wound up on the same place at the same time to do a little performance collaboration, which we'll be showing at the end in a little bit. Let's we had decided, everyone, that we're going to talk a little bit about the projects that brought us to Governor's Island, and it's going to be rather conversational, I think. I'm going to pull up some slides, but Emily, feel free to throw questions at me as I go along.
Okay.
All right, so I'm going to be sharing the presentation now. Let me know if you can see it. Emily, can you give me a thumbs up if you can?
That's great. Yeah.
Great. Awesome. So I'm going to try to talk about Kikucha, which is a project that I've been working on for the last couple of years. And I say that I'm going to try because I have approached this project as an elusive endeavor. I have approached this project understanding that I may not know where I'm heading to. So there's a component of uncertainty that I have paid respect to from the very beginning. And I think this comes from an understanding that we are in a moment where we have access to a lot of answers and uncertainties, right? We have the facts of a lot of things, and yet we're failing us. We're failing a lot of beings around us. So in order to actually bridge that gap, I think that there's, from my part as an artist, need to reach to the unknowable. Just to give an idea of what the form looks like, Kikucha is a series of video performances. These are live events that happen by the water, in which video projections are shared on the sail of a sailboat, along with a performance, along with a declamation. So what you're seeing right here is myself on the first presentation of Kikucha in 2022 on Luna, which is the name of this sailboat, doing a first presentation. There's video of this, a very short 2-minute video that you can watch on YouTube, and we'll provide a link for that later. That's as far as the form, right? A video performance. But then when it comes to the content, when it comes to the meat, when it comes to what the project is nourished by, it's a bit more complex. I started this project asking myself if what I'm doing is what the water wants. If I am moving in a way that would the water want me to move that way? And before that, there was a question of whether was it what the earth wanted, right? So first it was, is it what the earth wants? And that's almost like a question on my practice, on myself, that I have begun with. And this is very also linked to place. This question first came up when I was spending time in a ranch in Uruguay. So this connection to place is also very important because I didn't create this in a vacuum in an office or in a studio. I created this being in a specific place with a certain connection with nature. And that is a thread actually that I carried through the development of Kikucha. As you see on the left-hand side of the screen right here, there's a postcard on the top, and then there's a photograph. The photograph is taken from the sailboat from Luna in one of the many expeditions that I did to inform this project, because it was always important for me to be connected to the place that I was addressing, that I was thinking through, that I was thinking with, and putting myself in this context with the elements, with the winds, with the currents. Not only was an opportunity for myself to learn from these bodies of nature, from these forces, but also to put myself against the unknown. And here the unknown has a capacity to be known. I don't know it because I say wasn't a sailor before starting this, but I could learn it, right? With the project of Kikucha, I was not only trying to understand these things that I didn't understand, but I was also trying to reach for mystery. And I think that mystery is held in different ways by different beings. Here I bring the perspective of a copepod that moves vertically in the water as one way of thinking of migration. And along with that, I think of the ocean currents that take about 1,000 years to move around the globe, and how these two different moving experiences are so different, and yet they're speaking about a similar nature, is that everything is in motion. I'm going to drop this last piece here and then make a pause in case we need to clarify something. Emilie, it's really useful to have you here in case I'm missing some context, but really, this has become an exercise for me to think about epistemology, to think about which sources of knowledge and wisdom I'm leaning on, because I realized that decolonizing myself has to do with new ways of engaging with other beings and place, and that is inevitably connected with the ways that we approach knowing, right? With the way that we assess importance to place and other beings. And through the migration stories that I have been collecting, both from non-human and human species, there was one thing that was evident, and that is that the impacts of human activity and industrialization are basically setting priorities about which lives matter most. And that is a type of knowing, right? That is connected with our day-to-day. And in order to break away from that, I'm suggesting and telling myself, I need to break away from those practices. I need to start creating new ways of being and moving in the world. And to deepen that type of work, I am drawing from different authors, but one that really has inspired me is Boaventura de Sousa Santos, who's a Portuguese writer and teacher who talks about the epistemologies of the South and how Western-centric narratives are just one way that knowledge has been produced and in which science leans on, but it's not the only one. And my work has been to explore that other territory from which I also come from. So this is one of the last performances that I have done with Kikucha, and this has taken place in Narragansett Land, in Providence. This is another event in which we showed videos of folks telling their stories as they moved from Central America and the Caribbean into the US, as well as the migratory journeys of horseshoe crabs, for example, and other birds, as a way of offering these connections, right? And as we're doing this, there's also an opportunity for audience members to contribute with their own stories of migration through the creation of maps, subjective map making. So this is taking a tool that has been historically linked to colonizing purposes, charting the world for extractive purposes and reclaiming it as a tool for telling our own stories and drawing our own maps. This is a collage from another audience member who has shared, as you can see, this map really reflects the reality of this person, but not a geographic correspondence, along with an expedition, so to speak, that I have taken with Luna to an island also in the waters around Rhode Island. And this is making what I call making the invisible visible. This is a collage. This is what was exhibited at Swell House. This is what you can see, right? What I have been telling you all along is kind of like what's underneath the surface of the iceberg, which I think perhaps is the best use of this space right now to be sharing work. All right, so I don't know how I deal with time, Emily. I know we have said 10 minutes.
You're doing great. We're doing great. I'm so excited to hear you talk, and then as you're talking, I'm understanding more and more how much overlap there is in our projects and methodologies. I'm really struck by well, actually, I'd like to ask a clarifying question first. Kikucha, is that something that is that a term that you have come up with? Is that an old term that means something else? Could you clarify that for us?
Yeah, that is a fictional identity that has basically is the perspective from which this story is being told.
Okay.
So Kikucha, by way of these live performances, right, which is the format, is also creating a story.
Mm-hmm.
And that story is being told by the Kikucha people.
I see. And the
so I'm making things more confusing. But
I mean, I want to know more. Like, are we all in some way Kikucha people? Or do people become Kikucha people by becoming part of the project? Or is there, how many fictional elements are involved? Like I see a lot of poetry and fiction also entering.
Yeah.
I don't know if fiction is the right word. I think but different ways of knowing things is very, very key in what I've been reading about your work.
Yeah, yeah. So I think you're nailing it by asking that question, because we can all be part of the Kikucha people as they take footing in a future that this project is devising, and this project is being devised with other people. So each live event is held in collaboration with other artists who are bringing their perspectives, and the stories of folks who decide to share their journeys through the postcards, through the map making activities, is also part of the narrative that I think all kind of funnels into this identity, this fictional identity. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Okay, so would you say is it appropriate to say that maybe by taking part of this project and asking yourself about your journey in a very non-Western way, asking yourself very embodied and instinctive questions about your journey, you become part of Kikucha perhaps by undergoing that process?
Right. So that's what I can offer.
Yeah.
And I think it's one alternative to say you can take this path of decolonization, call yourself Kikucha if you want. Because I think my role as an artist is to provide alternatives,
to offer something
during this time. And so it is my way of saying there's a possibility of being intentional with the ways in which we identify and choose to live our lives. And so by creating this identity, I'm offering one way of doing that. And this is, again, how I choose to offer agency to audience members so that they decide what to do. They decide what to take from this and then make adjustments or not in their lives.
It's very powerful to name it, to give it an identity, a future identity. I think that's beautiful.
Yeah, I think all this is an exercise of imagination, right? Which is, that always comes back to me as the power in art making practices.
We should probably swap over.
Yeah,
but I would love to keep
I'm
talking.
curious to hear about your project and then chat some more.
Okay. Well, if someone can allow me to share my screen, because right now I'm not permitted.
You should be co-host already, unless that changed. Let me see.
I'm a participant.
Oh, I don't know why that happened. Sorry, I did make you co-host. There you are. A few seconds. Sorry. You should.
There we go. That's great. Okay, this should work. Can you see that?
Yes.
Yes.
Great, fantastic. Let me just make it bigger. Wow. Okay, great. So I also spent some time at Swale House this summer, working on a project that is an ongoing project. This is the third in the series, and the project is called Colombian Exchange. And it is it's evolving as I evolve my understanding of how all these complicated things fit together and how it fits with an environmental justice conversation, and how to start to make small changes in people's attitudes and understandings, and also empower people to make changes. So some overlap again with you, Hernán, but also different in the sense that my raw material is, I think, things that I'm observing that are real, that people don't notice. So in a sense, it's also opposite. You know, it's something that, I don't know if it's opposite, but it's related, but it's quite different in that sense. I'm looking around for things which are buried in plain sight and trying to make them very highly visible. So in this case, you know, I was looking at, potatoes are really interesting. Potatoes are, originally for the Andes. They were imported to Europe during the Columbian Exchange, and then ended up back here in 17 somethings, and have become such a huge staple food in many, many parts of the world. Many communities really rely on potatoes now. The way that they're farmed in order to produce massive amounts of them has to be, at the moment, commercially, is highly toxic. Monocultural farming of potatoes usually involves about 12 different chemical applications before they reach the grocery shelf, in order to keep them fungus-free, not sprouting, all the things that may feed on them in the ground, to exclude those things and to poison them off. And so monocultural farming is a problematic thing very much in many cases, and particularly with potatoes, because they're susceptible to various fungi. Corporations such as McDonald's, for example, require particular types of potato. Like in McDonald's case, it's the russet Burbank potato mix. It's the only one that makes a French fry long enough to stick out of the red box enough to make it palatable for their advertising. So as a result, massive swathes of the states are planted with this one type of potato, and that demand is responded to by huge chemical infusions all over the land, which is killing off microbes, killing off pollinators. It's very problematic, and it also ends up with a potato that, as a result, not only has a fairly low nutritional content, but also contains low trace levels of pesticides, which add up the more you eat. It's a very affordable food. It's an environmental justice problem. The farmers growing those potatoes do not eat them because they know what goes on them. So I've been this is not my first potato project, but in this case, I was really interested in reproduction on demand, which is what is going on in this commercial farming situation. It's like, we require this amount of product, right? And it needs to be worth this much. It needs to be delivered on time in this condition. And completely ignoring the fact that there's all these life forms are involved in those in those situations. So I'm kind of extracting potatoes from the supermarket as survivors of abuse. I'm taking them out of the fluorescent light, perfect geometric display, and putting them in a weird scrambled ecosystem, which they're already in, but giving them a chance to be in red clay, which is their native clay in the Andes is red clay. Putting them in red clay also as a metaphor, because in the Andes, if you eat wild potatoes, they're toxic to humans, but if you consume them with some clay, the clay actually adsorbs to the toxins and you can digest them. So I liked putting these pesticide-laden potatoes into clay. I don't know whether that actually removes the pesticides, but I liked it very much as a sort of symbolic move, and a little nod to their homeland. And when I was thinking about reproduction on demand, I was also doing a lot of reading, as we all are, about monuments and which monuments are being reconsidered these days. And of course, Columbus monuments are all over the States. And so thinking about the ecological scrambling and the amount of injustice that has ensued because of, imported diseases and massive amounts of deaths of indigenous peoples resulting from that. It's too complicated to cover in 10 minutes, but I think that probably most of you know a lot about this already. I was curious to take a monument that's reproduced on demand, en masse, all over the States. And I found this plaster bust of Columbus, which was already a reproduction of a reproduction. And so I took that image and I made my own reproduction of that, embedding potatoes into it like a strange little displaced farm or retirement home, perhaps, for these abused vegetables. And the potatoes kind of almost look like a disease, so they're also referencing that kind of history of the Columbian exchange, as well as food and affordable commercially farmed foods. You can still buy that plaster monument for about $900, and they're all over the country. So I made my own version. I'm just going to very quickly take you through the evolution of the project. This is the third version, but it started out here. I made a plaster bust, embedded the potatoes, and they immediately started sprouting, which I was thrilled about, because some industrially farmed potatoes can never sprout because they've been given so much sprout retardant that they really can't do it. But these were very happy to be in clay in the dark for a little while, and they started rooting right through the face. I then destroyed that to make a mold so I'd be able to reproduce it on demand. And here's a kind of mold making process. I now have one 8-part piece mold that I use for this project, and the busts are really an unlimited edition until the mold completely fails. So that's the kind of like timeline of the project. This is the second iteration. So it's the first one that came out of a press mold. It's kind of an absurdist performance process, forcing the clay into all the little crevices of this mold. I think that's really relevant to the project. A lot of this is forcing things into shapes that they don't want to be in. And I think of that as a great metaphor for kind of like land domination, and those types of farming practices that are forcing reproduction with chemical interventions, on time schedules. So that's really part of how I build the object in the first place. And I love that you can see the press mold seams, for example, and the way that the whole thing ages gives me a lot of joy and generates a lot of conversations about food, personal food stories and associations and disgust, rot, and a lot of words that come up with these projects that are related to filth and dirt and getting dirty and things that are underground being sort of generally unclean. And so the whole language is very loaded, quite toxic language around things related to dirt and soil and decomposing and things like that. So it's a very useful tool for me to be able to kind of like shift the psychology of how we see those kind of essential life cycles. This one ended up at Rosekill Art Farm. It's a performance site in the Hudson Valley. Hernán, I'd love to show you around there sometime. I think it'd be a great fit. But so this one kind of was outside for about 16 months, I think, and ended up as this kind of strange cracked blob inhabited by spiders and cockroaches and all kinds of different things. Then this takes us up to Governor's Island, which is a really, really amazingly, excitingly loaded site for a project like this. I was really stunned walking around the island, reading about the history of the Dutch arriving and, evicting Native American communities, raising the land of fruit and nut trees, of which it had been so abundant, and turning it into a fortress to exclude other people from entering. And then the Brits also. So in combination is that you now see these sort of remnants of that all over the island, and you also see little plants and you can sense the soil microorganisms that have been there all along and survived it and contain that history, and also imported plants that have now taken over. And there's a very scrambled history everywhere you look. There's even a Netherlands monument just across the the ferry, which still celebrates the, I think it's the unbroken friendship between the Dutch and the Native Americans. And this giant phallic gold pillar monument that somebody cleans regularly. It's kind of fascinating. So, and you know, there are all these sort of buildings in disrepair that were designed specifically to change the island from a sort of summer food camp, an abundant place, to an exclusion fortress. And then in the back, of course, you can see what's happened to Manhattan in the same way. So this project, I decided also to embed human manure into the monument to really, really activate the conversation about how humans are the only species that don't contribute their own digested matter back into the local environment. We just extract and then we flush that into the clean water systems. And that just seems, you know, totally normal, and otherwise it's gross. And so I think that's one of the many, many things that we just don't even think about. That's in plain sight. We do it all the time. And it's a very simple way in which we could generate fertilizer that would be highly nutritious. We would need chemical fertilizers for all of New York State, except for 2 tiny counties, if we all recycled our poop in this way. So I decided to try it in my own backyard, and got a very delightful surprise of a sprouting tomato plant. I must have eaten tomatoes that week. So I've harvested those tomatoes, and it's kind of an emotional experience. But for this version of Columbus, that was embedded, and it was also mixed with some local soil from right underneath the monument. So it's a living sculpture, this whole community, scrambled community from the inside of my body and the foods that I ate, and that site was all embedded in the red clay with the potatoes from the supermarket. And so that started out like this, and it was kind of open to the public, to as a big invitation to come and water it and to say, what the hell is this? What is this doing here? And so then I had some really exciting conversations with visitors, some of whom were disgusted or horrified, and some of whom were curious and thought it was weird, and some of whom were very excited. And I just learned so much, and I'm very grateful. And it seemed to have sort of taken on a life of its own at that point. And that's really how I think of the work. I just create something and step back, and at that point I'm observing, and I'm there for conversation, and I'm learning a lot. So that's kind of where I am, and it's ongoing. I don't quite know where it goes from here, and I'm really open to suggestions. So here are some people watering it at the beginning. That's Alec Ravensky on the right. You might know him from the Institute for Public Architecture on the island. And then it began to fall apart. His chin fell out. Here's some more visitors. The person on the right was really excited. A whole series of him with different facial expressions. But people came along and they were curious, and I've sort of written down a lot of notes from conversations. This project did not have a whole lot of time to sprout, so it started to fall apart really fast, which is also exciting. I've never experienced that before. It came apart quickly. You could still tell it was a monument, but you could also see really what it was made of. On the right, on the base there, that's the nose that fell off, kind of right on the corner. So the whole thing is very funny and silly and weird and creepy, and those are useful ingredients for starting conversations, I think.
I also really appreciate how people respond, or like how the piece is giving people an opportunity to respond to this narrative, right? As you pointed out, that young fellow over there was like very enthusiastic about it. There was something about themselves that was coming out to respond to this, which is a really, I think, important opportunity, right? That you're giving an audience.
I hope so. It was emotional for him. At first, he looked at the monument and he was like, "Is that Columbus?" And I said, "Yes, it is." And he said, "Is this pro-Columbus?" I was like, "Well, here's my project. Here's what it's about." And he was like, "Oh, great. Can I please water it?" And then he watered it for quite a long time. I also had a lot of people from different places coming in. I had a really wonderful conversation with 2 separate groups from Colombia, actually, which is very interesting. And about farming in the States. They had been living here for about 2 years. I think one group, and the others were visiting, and they'd been in town for about 8 weeks. And both sets of people said, "Oh, I'm so interested to talk more about this, because there are a lot of vegetables that in Colombia I can eat, and here I have all kinds of intolerances to the same foods." So then we talked about that for a while. But you know, those kinds of, it just keeps opening up in all these different ways. And we had a lot of conversations also about human feces and composting that, and thinking about microbes in different ways, and the psychology, and you're right to understanding that those are all around you all the time, and that that's just real. That's not a myth.
Yeah.
Maybe that's not something that's taught you as a child, so that's something that's important to know about life. And it ended up here, and a lot of potatoes were on the ground. And I thought it was kind of a funny way for it to have fallen apart at the end of the weekend. And then I had to come back because of my job. And so I came back to visit the statue on the day before Indigenous Peoples Day, which is also known as Columbus Day. So I thought I must go and see the progress of how it's been collapsing and whether people have been watering it. And so this is what I found when I got here. It had really come apart a lot. You could see a lot of roots, partly from the grass underneath the monument. Some potatoes had been rooting. One had made little tiny baby potatoes. And a lot of the potatoes at the base of the monument had sprouted and made a sort of impromptu little farm in the grass at the bottom, which I thought was super exciting. And that's the day on which Hernán and I met. And then more recently, I was displayed the remnants at the USI conference, which is a really amazing opportunity. I'm so grateful to be here and having these interdisciplinary conversations. So over to you, and I'm going to stop sharing.
Totally. I wonder if right now is a good moment to show the video of the performance we did, since that last photo of the monument is pretty much how I found it.
Let's do it.
All right. All right.
That's actually the first time I've seen that.
Yeah.
It's very exciting.
Right out of the
It was very moving for me that Hernán responded to the piece in this way, making such an immediate connection between the particular local waters of the Hudson, which are absolutely integral to the history of the Governor's Island and colonization of New York, with by connecting in this beautiful way our two projects. It was really stunning for me.
Yeah, and also for me, an opportunity to respond to your work from what I have been doing with Kikucha, which at the time I had just sailed from Rhode Island to New York, right? So those waters I had just navigated through like about a week before that time. So I think like that's one of the most beautiful experiences that I had in that time, was that ability to collaborate, to think, to move together, which I think is also prompted by this aperture to say, I don't know what I'm going to find, right? Which is a little bit what was the ethos of the project that I've been moving with. I would now I just would love to really see if any folks want to share thoughts or questions as a response to what we've been sharing so far.